This afternoon, I'm going to talk about identifying natural resource concerns on U.S. grazing lands, principally rangeland, and why this information is important for developing grazing land programs in states. The resource concerns protocol is a qualitative protocol in the NRI data collection process. This slide shows what an example sample unit looks like. There are 250-foot transects. I'll show another slide here in a minute that kind of shows the layout, but here's the types of information that we collect on the transect. On the right, there's a bunch of quantitative information such as foliar, cover by species. It's 6 different layers through the canopy. We also measure ground cover, basal plants, rocks, microphytes, litters in the above canopy. We take height measurements along these transects and also collect production data in clip quadrats. And then the qualitative information includes recording conservation treatments that we see that are obviously being applied on the site, and then the resource concerns, which I'm talking about today. And then in addition, we do a rangeland health assessment. We do a complete plant census of all the species and estimate a density value based on kind of a log scale. And then we also record disturbances on the site. Now this shows just kind of an outline of what that macroplot looks like. It's a 0.4 acre macroplot, and the way the transects are laid out, we take photographs at each of the ends of these transects, plus other photographs of interest that may apply to the sample. So in looking, at the computer-assisted instrument that we use to collect the data, this is what the resource concerns screen looks like when the field people are entering data. There's 22 resource concerns. They're separated into categories. As you see, there's soil and erosion, and then at the end, there's animals, domestic animal questions. Basically, it's just a yes or no answer, and it's based on what we call the conservation management unit, not the Macroplot. And what the conservation management unit is, it's basically the field. And if there's no field boundary, such as a fence, we use the rule that will extend 1,000 feet from the center point out, and that'll be our conservation management unit. So if you look at some of the definitions, all these 22 resource concerns have definitions. If we look at noxious and invasive plants, for example, that's basically just what it is. Are there noxious and invasive plants present? And is it over and above what you would consider, say, in a reference plant community? It's not all invasive plants are noxious or introduced species from exotic places around the world. Juniper and mesquite are commonly invasive plants. They may or may not be part of the ecological site description. So in looking at the data, this is based on NRI data from 2004 to 18, includes almost 30,000 NRI points across the West. And the most dominant recorded conservation concern was noxious and invasive plants. Almost 60% of the total acres of non-federal rangeland had yes recorded for noxious and invasive plants. And the second resource concern was production, health, and vigor, and so forth and so on, forage, quality, and palatability. Interestingly enough, the fourth resource concern was erosion, sheet and rill erosion. I find that pretty interesting. Almost 40% of the non-federal rangelands recorded a concern regarding erosion, sheet and rill. And also gully erosion. There's almost 20, 22% of the rangeland sites that we evaluated recorded a gully problem. So these values here are part of the 22 resource concerns, and the ones that are represented on this graph are greater than 10% of the acres. So in looking at the invasive plant situation more closely, since that was the #1 concern, we'll look at the just introduced species. And on this graph, it's basically species that were present on greater than 3% of the total acreages that we sample across these 30,000 points. So basically, there were 559 species that we identified as introduced species, and lo and behold, #1 species, Bromus tectorum cheatgrass, Kentucky bluegrass, #2, yarrow, #3, so forth and so on. The next slide shows, we'll just kind of focus on the introduced grasses, or where the slide before included all plant growth forms. And so this graph represents introduced grasses that are greater than 2% of the non-federal rangeland acres. We recorded 143 species total of introduced grasses. 69 were annuals, 74 were perennials. The leading species again was cheatgrass, Kentucky bluegrass. We have smooth brome, crested wheatgrass, and then there's there's Medusa heads down the line there, as you would expect. A lot of these leading species, such as Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome, are primarily found in the northern Great Plains. Okay, let's take a look at, for example, shrub and tree species. The Opuntia species were the most problematic. And the Opuntia, the first one was where the field people just identified Opuntia to genus only. And then we had Opuntia polycantha, or prickly pears, #2. So basically looking at that, there's almost 50% of the rangeland acres have a presence of Opuntia that's considered a resource concern. Mesquite was #3, and that's almost 20% of the rangeland acres for mesquite. And then let's see, if you look on that list, I'm looking for, there's Juniperus virginiana, one of the most problematic juniper species, eastern red cedar. Looks like maybe it's #15 or so in there. Okay, so if we we can also focus in out, these other graphs I've shown you are just based on all the rangeland sites included across the US, but we also can focus in on individual MLRAs or ecoregions. This happens to be a level 3 ecoregion, Central Great Plains. We could also look at ecological sites if we have enough ecological sites represented for a specific site designation. So in looking at the Central Great Plains, we see that smooth brome, which is a perennial, was the #1 prevalent species. Bromus tectorum was 3. We have Poa pratensis, let's see, 1, 5 or 6. And so forth and so on. Ag cristatums down there. These are all invasive grasses that are found on greater than 1% of the acres. So I'm just kind of showing, we can kind of dig in deeper if we wish. and look at some of the dynamics for any of these, any kind of, whether it's perennial forbs, if the use is for monarch butterflies or pollinating insects or invasive plants. So in closing, why is this information important? Well, this information is used by the agency to obviously obtain scientifically credible information based on a national level, regional level, sub-regional levels, major land resource areas, ecoregions or ecological sites. The information provides data for special resource issues such as the monarch, pollinating insects, sage grouse, lesser prairie chicken, and also the states use this information for helping to prioritize their resources, funds, and personnel in addressing these different problems on rangeland. So that concludes my presentation.